Hello, guys. Good afternoon, and welcome back to my page and my channel. So, I decided to do this video inside because it's quiet inside, even though I prefer outside lighting, natural lighting, but I'm doing this video inside because it's, like I said, it's quieter and I think I can focus more. And I'm really excited about this topic, you guys, because I actually just recently created this theory and named it after myself. Like, I'm so excited. I'm so happy about it, you guys. You guys know I love to create. And I'm always thinking about ways to be innovative and ways to give back, ways that I can be of an influence to other people because that's just my nature. Before I get started, I have to kind of I have to like tell a little joke. Okay, it may be funny to you guys, maybe not, but something I noticed like recently in my video, I know for or a fact, I know for sure that before I start my videos, right, I always like make sure that it's nothing in my nose. So I clean my nose out for boogers. This may be too much information for some of y'all, but hey, y'all know I'm pretty transparent. So yeah, like I make sure like, my nose is clean and things are, look good and I have a professional kind of glow to me. And I went back and looked at one of my recent videos because I always watch my videos after I record them. I'm looking at myself and I'm just like, what is that thing in my freaking nose in the beginning of the video? I know it was not there before I started the video. I know it wasn't because I always check. Like, that's one of the places I make sure I check. I check my eyes and I check my nose. I know y'all like, what in the hell? But no, so seriously, I check those things because sometimes, I mean, it's just natural. We're human beings, we get crust in our eyes and, things in our nose, dust or boogers, whatever you want to call it. So I have to check that because I know it can be a distraction when you guys are watching it and y'all don't want to see shit hanging from my nose, let alone myself. Like, I damn sure don't want to see anything hanging from my nose. So I always check that. But I noticed, like, the video I think I made yesterday, it was some shit hanging from my nose. I'm like, what? I was so upset, but you know what? I say, you know what? I can't let that let me down because I know the video that I made was a good, strong, solid video. So I feel like it's not going to take away from my video that I had. It was something. And then I went back and I started thinking, I'm like, is Facebook fucking with me? Like, did they put that in there? Did they edit my video? Because even I noticed some of the words in the video were different. The title of the video that I'm talking about is The Need for White Supremacy and Racial Oppression. And I noticed, like, I think the video had been edited to say the need for the white supremacy. I'm like, I know I didn't put the white supremacy. That makes no sense. Like, why would I put the before white supremacy? But anyway, y'all, I was like, wait a minute. I know I'm not tripping. So, of course, before I did this video, I had to double check and make sure. Y'all see nothing in my nose. Y'all see, I don't see nothing in my nose, but so I better not go back and watch this video and find something in my nose. Okay. Now that I got that out of the way, on to the reason why I decided to do this video. Like, it is so important because, as you guys know, I'm trained to become a clinical psychologist in my third year of a PhD program, and I am surrounded by psychologists, right? In academia and professional settings, just everywhere, right? I'm just surrounded by psychologists. And I've been noticing some things that I want to bring to you guys' attention and that actually shape my theory for 5 effective characteristics in psychology. 5 characteristics in effective psychologists, essentially. 5 things, characteristics that make a psychologist effective. Now, I say characteristics because I think this is something that speaks to a person's character. Yes, they can become skills, but I think it's more about a person's character, who that person is naturally, I say. So that's the reason why I call the video 5 characteristics of an effective psychologist. And yes, there are 5. And interesting because it's a theory that I am going to develop, that I pretty much already developed. I'm going to share it with you guys. And It's actually self-named, so I named it after myself. My last name, Leach. It's an acronym. As I'm so excited about it. But it's an acronym that, represents the 5 letters of my last name, Leach. And so I'll be talking to you guys about those 5 characteristics in this video. Now, I have to say that the first 2 letters, which are the first 2 characteristics, I was inspired by Carl Rogers. He is a humanistic psychologist, or was, but I kind of still speak him into the presence as if he never died. But he actually was around from 1902. He was born in 1902 and I think died in 1987. Humanistic psychologist. Every psychology student knows about him. At least they should anyway, because he's like the foundation of psychology. But he was prominent. His period that he reigned from was like in the 1940s to the 1980s. And he was one of the 4 founders of humanistic psychology. It's really important because this type of psychology, this area of psychology, is the foundation by which psychologists and therapists, they use to establish a relationship, the whole humanistic side. And the first 2 qualities, which I'm going to get into in a minute, come from Carl Rogers. He's the one that says that these 2 characteristics are essential to building a therapeutic relationship and ultimately bringing about change in a client. Given that I was inspired by Carl Rogers with the first 2 characteristics in my theory, I still added my own spin to it. I added my own interpretation, which you guys will see in this video. And, I feel like I've developed his concepts that I'm going to talk to you guys about a little bit more, with my own experience and my own perception observations that I've made in the field. So, all right. So I know you guys are waiting like, come on, what are these things? What are these 5 characteristics? So I'm going to go ahead and get into it. So, as I said, the theory is my last name, Leach. That's just a name, but it's an acronym. And the letters, the first one, L, is listening. Yes, you guys, listening. It is so important. I cannot emphasize this enough, the importance of listening. And with listening comes learning. So you can say the L stands for listening, and the L stands for learning. But listening, I'm going to focus on listening for a minute because I feel like a lot of people, they missed it. They miss it. And I remember when I was in my master's degree program many years ago, I always have to think back because I'm like, okay, how old am I? I'm 35. My master's program that I started was like right after I finished my bachelor's degree from Florida State University. So I graduated with my bachelor's degree in 2006. And yes, dates are important, so you guys can put things into perspective. So I graduated from Florida State 2006, and I started my master's degree that same year. And I remember in that training program, like we did a lot of exercises to train us on how to listen, because there are many different ways of listening. And that's what my theory, that's what my theory essentially addresses. Excuse me, guys. Listening. Now, Carl Rogers, he talks about the importance of listening, and it's important to listen to what the client says. But where I add to his theory is the different ways in which we can listen. With the different ways in which we can listen, the different ways in which listening takes place. Because you can listen on many different levels. And listening, as Carl Rogers says, is a form of attending. You're attending to the client. You're attending to their behavioral characteristics, things that you can observe physically through their behavior, their nonverbal, their body language, which says a lot. But the listening I'm talking about is listening with your ears. And it is a skill. I think that it can be a skill, something that a person can practice over time and get better at and eventually somehow perfect. But I think that that's the reason why I call these characteristics. I think it really speaks to a person's character, who they are. And some people are good listeners, and some people just aren't good listeners. They are terrible at it, you know? And with listening comes patience. And I emphasize this, and it really, I think that I start my theory with this because that's the foundation. Like, how can you begin to help someone if you're not willing to listen? And you have many different people that listen different ways, you know. I've heard this over and over again from colleagues, from professors, even from psychologists who say that, oh, I'm just trying to hurry up and get to what the client is saying. I want them to answer the question. I want them to just get straight to the point, so to speak, right? And I kind of have a problem with that. I mean, I understand where that approach might be useful in certain situations or contexts, but when it comes to therapy and especially developing a relationship with your client, for those who are therapists or aspiring to become therapists, and even for those who are clients looking for a therapist, like you, it's important that you choose a therapist who listens, who can listen, who has that characteristic. Because again, like I was saying, you have some psychologists who really don't care how you get to the answer. They don't really care all about the meat, the things that you're giving them. You can, excuse me, you can give the therapist 5 minutes of a story, but if they ask you, were you abused as a child? And the answer that they're trying to get at is yes or no, a specific answer, they don't care about that story. They just want to hear yes or no. Some psychologists, anyway. But I think that's it. And that's part of the reason why I put listening as a first characteristic in my theory, because I think that's a huge mistake that so many therapists make, psychologists make. Like, how can you dismiss those pieces of the client's story? It's like you don't care about what that client had to share. Only thing you're concerned about is them answering your question. I'm like, no, it cannot be that way. Like, what is in my nose? Like, no, it cannot be that way. You miss out on so much information. There's so much data there to collect, to observe, but you're just like, okay, I'm trying to get to the answer. And so what do some therapists do who have that approach? Like, they're just trying to get a direct answer. They sometimes tune out. So you can give them all this meat information, right? This meaty information that you're trying to build a foundation for them to understand your answer, but they just want to hear the answer. And so then they may come back 5 or 10 minutes later and ask you a question that is very relevant to all of that meat that you've given them before to get to that specific answer they were trying to get at a couple of minutes ago, and they miss it. They're like, okay, they ask you the question, and you're like, okay, I actually just spent 5 minutes of my time giving you all this information, and you go and ask me a question that I already answered that? How frustrating could that be from the perspective of a client who has to go and regurgitate all this information they already shared? They already taken the time. We know time is of essence. It's important. How a therapist treats the client's time says a lot. And some therapists, unfortunately, are very dismissive of a client's time. But yes, you have to value a client's time. If they've taken the time to share all of this meat, even though your initial question may have not necessarily solicited that information. Like, you may not have been looking for that much information, essentially, right? But they've given it to you. how can you just take it and throw it away? Not only are you throwing away their information that they've given you, this data, essentially in scientific terms, but you're throwing away their time. Now, granted, like I said, there are different approaches to collecting information. There's different approaches that therapists take to listen, to gather information, depending on the context. If you're in a context where, let's say you're in a hospital, you may only have a certain amount of time to meet with the client, then I can understand. You may only have 15 minutes, like psychiatrists. They may only see clients for 15 minutes. So specific questions that they're trying to get at, that they need answers for in a short amount of time. I understand that. But I'm talking about therapy. This theory, the Leach theory, is in reference to psychotherapy, individual psychotherapy. It can be applied to couples therapy, marriage and family, but it's psychotherapy. And we know the psychotherapy hour is typically 1 hour. It can go longer. It can be for 8 weeks, 10 weeks, months, and years. You get what I'm saying? So there you have time. I'm not talking about something that's very time specific where you're working for DMH, and we know DMH is all about the cookie cutter. You have to have this information by this certain time, and everything has to be measurable, and it's just about fitting in within a certain time frame for reimbursement. It's about money. I'm not speaking from that perspective in terms of, okay, we got to get this done because we have to meet a certain deadline because the insurance company said that you have to be able to show that you've made X amount of change, and prove that and verify that in a certain amount of time, just so you can get reimbursed. I am not talking about that because I don't operate from that perspective. And looking to the future, I plan to go into private practice and I may take insurance, but I don't think that's going to be my primary focus. That's not going to be my primary clientele. It's going to be people who, self-pay. But, no, because that's not how therapy is. I feel like it's an injustice to try to putting, like they say, a square peg into a round hole. Like you're trying to force something that doesn't fit. Like forcing a time limit on something, boxing therapy into this small amount of time, forcing, everything to be done. Okay, you gotta do this, gotta do that by a certain amount of time, you gotta do this, no. That's not how therapy works. It's a process. It definitely is a process. And for me, as a budding psychologist, I can definitely appreciate that process, and, give the client time, give the client space. That's my belief. Give the client the time and space that they need to tell their story. You might can tell a story in 5 minutes, where it may take a client to tell an hour, the same story. It's okay. It's not, I wouldn't say it's necessarily a right or wrong way, but I do have a preference, and I would prefer to give a client that space, the 1 hour or however long it takes, Sometimes there may be some resistance to them sharing their story, and it may take time. And even if, just because, okay, you may perceive it as resistance, like, oh, there's a block, like they're trying to hide something. No, it can be a number of reasons why it may take a client, a certain amount of time to tell a story. And I feel like it's not the therapist's job to rush the client to tell that story. Give them that time, give them that space. And with listening, like I said, comes patience. It's not that, you have to rush the client to tell this story just so that it makes you feel better. It's not about you as a therapist, it's about the client. And so often do therapists forget that. Listening. You learn so much by listening. Listen with your eyes, listen with your ears. Listen with your smell, use all of your senses to listen, to take in what the client is saying, because there's so much information there. And you can listen on so many different levels. You can listen in terms of trying to assess certain patterns that the client is saying. You can listen for the way a client says something in terms of their process. You can listen in terms of their content, what the client is saying, how the client is saying it, how fast the client is saying it, certain details that the client mentions. There's many different ways that you can listen. And I say that when I was talking about just giving the client space and the time and not being so quick to force the client to tell their story in a certain amount of time, is because there's an art to it. I mean, yes, I look at psychology as a science, but it's definitely an art, and it's how the client tells their story, just like an artist painting a picture. Let how they paint the picture, the amount of time it takes them to paint the picture, to draw the picture. If you were a psychoanalyst and you were analyzing that process, that will give you so much information. But if you're the type of therapist who is so pressed for time, you're going to miss that. You're going to be like, all right, go ahead and draw me a picture. Just draw the picture. And you know what the artist is going to say? I don't work that way. That's not how we do art. Now, for some people, because not everyone is the same, some people, they actually do work better under pressure. But when it comes to the creative process, that's not how it works. And when it comes to therapy, that's definitely not how therapy should go. So that's the L, listening. Listening. That's the L in Leach, the theory that I developed. The next characteristic that I think is important and that makes an effective psychologist. Oh, and I meant to differentiate between psychologists and therapists because I think there is a difference. Before I begin to talk about empathy, the second characteristic. Now, with psychologists versus therapists, yes, psychologists, part of what psychologists do is therapy. But I think there's a difference because you can have a master's level therapist. And then you have some people who train in PhD programs and they get licensed as psychologists, but they're more like therapists, It's like they're more, because there's a practitioner side to it and there's a scientific side to it. They're more on the practitioner side, being a therapist. And there's nothing wrong with that. But I would like to say that encompassing both is actually more effective. When you can encompass being a practitioner and being a scientist, I think you bring more to the table as a psychologist. You are in better service of the client when you can operate from a scientist practitioner model. And that's how most PhD clinical psychology programs are developed. I mean, that's their aim, is to train scientist practitioners. And so it kind of sometimes confuses me when you come across psychologists, who wear that title, psychologist, but they're more practitioners. And I get it within our field. Actually, there is a movement kind of away from the scientific framework. So you have people who are trained as PsyDs, meaning they're doctors in psychology, whereas PhDs are doctors in philosophy. And it's a different approach. It definitely is a different approach. And I can see how psychologists, PsyD psychologists and PhD psychologists differ in the way that they think. I can see it because PhDs think like scientists, generally speaking, historically speaking, because that's how we're trained, and being that I'm a student, I'm, trained to become a psychologist. I'm just saying psychologists in general, that's how psychologists are trained. historically. We have to take statistics, we take research, and it's based on science. It's not based on assumptions. It's not based on gut feelings. Yes, you use your intuition, you use all of that. But when it comes to forming a conceptualization of what's going on with the client, you're not so quick to just say, "Oh, well, my gut told me this." That's more like working from the framework of art. Because yes, psychology is an art and therapy is an art. But it's beautiful, I think, when you can blend the two together. When you can use your intuition and use your scientific hat. You have on both hats at the same time to be able to better serve the client. And I think the biggest error that a lot of therapists or psychologists make, who are a lot of times PsyDs, would have doctors in psychology, they forget the scientific part, so they're very quick to make assumptions, so quick to make assumptions, so I just wanted to make that differentiation. And when I mean quick, it's like they may have a hypothesis on something and it may come as a gut feeling, right? And they just run with it and they don't consider any other possibilities. They may see that a client has expressing some resistance, right? And then they may develop a quick assumption on why they're being resistant, And a lot of times it's not anything positive. They're like, "Oh, you're being resistant because you don't want to be here, or you don't like me," or a number of things that may have nothing to do with nothing. But I think therein lies the difference between the therapist and the psychologist. Because psychologists, we know, have a higher level of training. They just operate differently. And definitely PhD psychologists traditionally just see things from a different perspective. I mean, they should. If you're trained as a scientist, then you should kind of think like a scientist. And scientists just don't jump to conclusions. They develop theories and they test those theories. They put those theories through tests. They don't just say, "Oh, I have this theory. Oh, it's a gut feeling. All right, that's it." No, you have to take some time, run it through the scientific method. Which I know a lot of people, a lot of therapists, they're like, "I don't care about no scientific method." Like, no, I know this for sure. That got to be it. That's it. That's it. It's like, stop it. So I just want to give you guys a kind of a foundation of the way I think. I've always been fascinated by science, and I remember even thinking back to when I was in middle school, I actually won first place in the science fair. It was really amazing. But that, and in me winning that, like, I think that inspired me, encouraged me to just continue on with my thirst for science and just learning more about science, doing things a scientific way, and seeing that psychology can be a science. We do research and we apply the scientific method to understanding and answering certain questions related to psychology. We're scientists as well. So on to the next characteristic, which would be empathy. Oh my gosh. Empathy. That's another one. That's another one. And the first thing I think of empathy is I think of this friend that I had in New York. He is actually an NYPD officer, been with NYPD for many, many years. And I remember him telling me this story about his experience as an NYPD officer in New York. And he was saying how, he works on, like, he's the one that responds to these calls of people, attempting to commit suicide. And so he responded to this call where this guy was on top of the roof of a building and he threatened to jump off the building. And it wasn't his first time. And so he said that one day when he responded, he went, up there and to intervene. And while the other officers were like trying to be empathic with the guy and just like so concerned about him, he took a different approach and he was just like, "Man, if you're gonna kill yourself, just go kill yourself. Just do it, Like, why you gotta sit up here and involve us in this whole enactment when you ain't done it yet?" And he was like, that was probably like the fifth or sixth time that he had been called out for the same guy who had been threatening to commit suicide. you know. And when he told me this story, like I felt so bad. I'm like, dude. Now granted, he is a kind of like a comedian. He has a sense of humor, you know, which I do too myself. But I'm like, come on, this is suicide we talking about, right? Like, I'm like, really? You took that approach? And he's like, yeah, man. Like, I'm sick and tired of that. Like, dude just want attention and it's annoying and it's wasting, you know, taxpayers' dollars, wasting my time. You know, we go up there to the top of the building and he ain't gonna kill himself. He just want attention. He was just like, he felt like that was a correct intervention to use at that point in time with this guy, considering that he knew the guy, like he had responded to his call before. And I guess he felt like he already developed rapport, but I'm just like, come on. I don't care how much rapport you think you got with a person. You never know a person. And people in relationships can attest to this. Like, okay, I do have to check the time. But yes, people in relationships can attest to this. It's like people think they know someone. You can be in a relationship with a person for 5 or 10 years and you're like, oh, I know them, so I can say that, or I could do this with them, you know, like kind of cross the line or push the envelope with them, thinking you know them. And I think that's the biggest thing. You think you know a person, you don't know a person. So sometimes you just gotta be careful. It's just be careful with that. Thinking you know someone, thinking you kind of go certain places with a person, just assuming, you know, don't assume you know someone, you know. You sometimes people barely even know themselves. So to assume you know just, oh, I know them, so I can go there because I develop a rapport. Like, no. I'm like, dude, you was kind of taking a chance there. But I mean, thankfully the guy didn't kill himself and they was able to, you know, bring him down or whatever. But that reminds me when I think about empathy, that story, because it really stands out. And it just kind of goes to show that I don't, not to say all police officers are like that, of course, but we know like the culture in criminal justice and the police force, you know, police are trained a certain way. And I do believe they do have some training on in psychology, but it's not extensive. And the way that police are trained, they're trained like to respond to life or death type of situations, like very threatening, you know, volatile situations, right? And so being that, it's like, yes, safety first, you know, and they have to think quick and respond quick. And a lot of times it's either them or the other person, you know, that's when they carry guns because they, you know, are essentially licensed to shoot and to kill a person if the situation presents itself. I get it, you know, so they definitely have a different approach than, let's say, psychologists. And that's why I think that I don't know if police would make good psychologists. I even told the guy friend that I was telling you guys about that I don't know you would make a good psychologist, dude, because that ain't something we would say to a client, you know, per se, like go ahead and kill yourself. I mean, I know there's this whole thing about paradoxical intent, but legally and ethically, I don't know if APA would approve of that. And that speaks to the reality. It's just the difference in approach. You know, police are very cut and dry, you know, and they're not as empathic. I mean, granted, if police were empathic, not to say all police are like this, because of course I'm kind of speaking in general terms, but just the way that they are trained, you know, they don't respond like, oh, well, how you doing? They're talking about criminal behavior, like police who work and directly to enforce these criminal laws. I'm talking about those kinds of police. It's like, come on, with criminals and like crime behavior. No, they're not trained to be like, oh well, how do you feel when you know you slap your wife? You know? No, like yeah, maybe therapists would kind of take that approach or something like that, but police, no. You broke the law, your ass is going to jail. They is very hard nosed, you know, no holds bar, like straightforward, direct, and not that much empathy. And it makes sense because it's like you are enforcing the law, you know. So you ain't got time to get on someone's like try to side with someone. Now, granted, there are situations where yes, they may, and I'm thinking of like hostage situations where you have a hostage investigator come in and yeah, you're trying to align with the person to show them that okay, you're with them, But that's only serves as a mechanism just to, get them to lower their guard, lower their defenses so that they don't harm anyone. So yes, I can understand that in hostage situations, but overall, I don't know. Like certain professions and even certain people, they're just not empathic. That's just not who they are. Like they don't care about other people's feelings. And to be empathic means that not that you don't have your own feelings, of course, but you can put yourself in a person's shoes. You can position yourself in the shoes of your client. So if a person has experienced abuse, you may not have experienced abuse ever in your life, physical or sexual, but you at least make an attempt to put yourself in the shoes of your client to see what would it look like. And then part of that requires some imagination, but part of that just requires some humanity. And unfortunately, some people just don't have it. I mean, they're very hardened by life, so it's hard for them to have this empathy towards other people. It's like sociopaths. They don't have empathy, because that part of them has been shut off for many different reasons. A lot of it has to do with their childhood and their upbringing, It's like maybe they were thrown away as a child. No one cared for them. So how can you develop empathy for someone else if no one even gives a fuck about you? It makes sense why some people don't have empathy, but empathy in the context of therapy is important. It's important that therapists have empathy because, like I said at the beginning of this video, listening and empathy are like two prerequisites, according to Carl Rogers, that are necessary to developing rapport with your client. And rapport is necessary as a therapeutic mechanism for change, to align with your client. If your client feels like they're heard, that you're listening to them, and they feel that you can relate to them through empathy, they're going to be more likely to open up. You see how that works? It works like magic. And it amazes me when you have some psychologists or therapists like, why are you so closed off? Or why are you defensive? And you don't want to talk. Go back to Psychology 101. That's why I think, because you have the veterans in the game, and I've been seeing this a lot lately, where it's like they kind of look down on like the newbies, right? Or you're an intern or you're a trainee, and they're just like, just because they're licensed, they assume, I guess, that they're experts. Like, okay, they've been doing this for so many years, so they got it. And I think they get too comfortable with that kind of mentality because they assume, okay, I got this. I've been doing this for X number of years. You can't tell me nothing. It's like maybe the longer a person has been in the field may not necessarily be positively directly correlated to their level of expertise. Maybe perhaps the longer a person has been in the field, the less likely they are to practice those concepts and perform up to a certain standard because they feel like I've been doing this, so I can kind of sit back a little bit. I don't have to really go by the book, so to speak, because I'm in here. I feel like you see it a lot, especially with interns and the newbies. They are the ones who are most likely to go by the book. Why? Because they feel like, okay, I just got my foot in the door. So, okay, sorry, y'all let my southern accent come out, but I just got my foot in the door. So I don't want to jeopardize that, essentially, right? So they do everything by the book because they feel like they have to, their license, they just got their license. Just like when you just get your driver's license, like I gotta drive both hands on the wheel, right? Like making sure you do everything right, looking over your shoulder, just doing everything according to the driver's ed book. But then after you had your license for 50 years, you're like, I got this, and you start a little bit breaking the law, so to speak, because you feel like you can kind of let your hair down a little bit. That's what I mean. So the veterans, according to the psychologists who have been here in the field for many years, I mean, yes, most states require, in order to maintain a license, you have to get your CEUs, which are continuing education units to maintain your license. So then they make you go to certain classes. They make you do a certain number of CEUs every period that you have to renew your license so that you stay on top of the game, because things change, policies change, things change. You kind of stay fresh. It's nothing like a fresh pair of eyes, having this newness. So yeah, that's important. And I feel like everybody need to do that. And you have a lot of veterans in the game be like, oh, the interns need to go to therapy, because they make in the PhD programs, or I know like psychology, doctoral level psychology programs, they require us to go to our own personal therapy. That's important. We have to go to therapy to work on our own stuff, because we all human beings, we all got our own stuff. And even if everything has been resolved, let's say all our childhood traumas and everything we've been through in life, let's say it's been resolved, I think still I see therapy as a luxury. It's still beneficial to go to therapy and engage in therapy, just so you are aware, which is my third characteristic. So far we talked about listening, empathy, and the third one is awareness. LEA. Awareness is so important. That's what you gain when you're in therapy. You gain a better awareness of yourself as a human being. It's like through relationships with other people is how you become conscious of who you are. You can do that alone, but it's better. You're challenged in certain ways that you aren't when you're alone, and knowing who you are as a person, knowing the things that trigger you is important. You have to know that before you even go in and call yourself trying to treat a client, because a client may do certain things and bring in certain things into the room that may trigger you. And if you're not aware, you're not going to have that stuff in check. It's going to come out in session. You have to be aware of self, and not only aware of self, but aware of what's going on with your client, just as much as you're aware of what's going on with the client. Because I think that's easier to do, I think, for therapists, to observe the client and observe when they're becoming anxious, looking at their body language, looking at when they're moving their legs, or when they take, a scoot up, or they kind of sink down into the couch. Like, I know I'm pretty good at that. I notice like changes when as I'm talking to my client. I notice when a client has shifted and does this, and that of course has its own meaning, or when a client yawns, or when a client comes in like, I think I want to lay down and just relax, you're on your chair, whatever, or on your couch, just different things that a client may do. When a client turns away, and they're kind of looking off, or when they don't make eye contact, when they do make eye contact, when they begin to cry, when there's silence, all of that matters. That speaks to awareness. But that's awareness of what the client is doing behaviorally. But what about us as therapists? Are we aware of what's happening with ourselves in the room? And not just in the room, but even outside of therapy. Are we aware of ourselves as just people outside of being a therapist? I know I am. And it's interesting. I find like my life just, of course, I wrote a whole book on it, but I think I'm a lot aware of who I am, and it's still much more to learn. That's the whole thing about my L and my acronym, LEACH, is that learning for me has been a lifelong process. I love learning about myself, because I feel like when you think you know who you are, when you think you know yourself, there's just more to learn. And it's beautiful, because it's like meeting a new person, so to speak. Not that, you just become this new person every single day, but it's like a new discovery, so to speak. When you meet someone new, it's that whole experience, that novel experience that is exciting to me. So same thing when I discover something new about myself, I'm just like, wow, that's me. Whether it's good, bad, or indifferent or ugly, I don't care. It's just, I accept all parts of who I am. As I know even the so-called bad parts, which I'm more of a positive psychologist, so I don't look at things in terms of good and bad, but I know that's how a lot of you guys understand things. So I have to kind of put that qualifier on it, is that for me, like even the bad things, so to speak, like I embrace them about myself, you know? People I know even may have observed some things about me. Oh, you defensive, or you did. I'm like, okay, but I like my defensiveness. Now I know sometimes it can get in the way, but like I said, I come from a different school of thought, and so even when clients are defensive, I don't look at it as, oh, they doing something bad. I'm like, they're a human being. That's how human beings respond to threat or a different situation, something that doesn't feel familiar to them, or something that makes them feel unsafe, or whatever meaning that it has. Is something, you know, and how they respond to it is just what makes them a human being. That's like white people looking at black people. Oh, they just so dead. They defensive. You know, they're argumentative. They're like all these labels, especially put on black women. This and that. And I'm just like, okay, maybe it serves a function. Maybe it serves a purpose given on a certain context. Because that's the way I see things. That's the way I conceptualize things, not just in working with clients, but in life. I see the big picture. I don't just look at this. I conceptualize things in terms of the context, the social context. There are so many different layers that speak to that, you know? That's why I think that's why time is so important, and slowing things down and being able to analyze things on different levels. It takes time. It's not about just rushing to get to a certain answer, but it's about understanding the meaning of things on many different levels. So awareness. And that's why it's important to be in therapy, not just for the newbie therapist, but for all therapists. And I think especially the veterans, because that's even more reason why you should be in therapy. You've been seeing these clients for all kinds of years. So, yeah, of course, the longer you're in the game, the more vicarious trauma you have experienced. And I've heard therapists say this. It's like, oh, the newbie therapists, they really need to be in therapy. I'm like, no, we all need to be in therapy. We all do. And it ain't just therapists and psychologists. It's people from all many different professions, especially people who work with people, whether it's daycare providers, they need therapists. Like I feel generally all of us need therapy, but of course some professions like are a little bit more stressful than others. You know, firefighters, they need therapy. Oh my gosh, because there's incidents with within the fire departments that, you know, they have issues with drinking and even suicide. It's unfortunate because the work that they do, man, just think about the kind of work that firefighters are faced with, police officers are faced with. That's a challenging job. A lot of people don't even want to do that, you know? And we didn't even talk about military veterans, you know? That's not to put labels on them or point fingers. I'm not in the business of pointing fingers at nobody. That ain't even my style. I'm just bringing an awareness, you know, as the characteristics suggest, that we have to understand, even like military veterans or people who are active soldiers in the military, like that's a lot. They're faced with a lot. That's where PTSD was discovered in military veterans first. You know, they're exposed to all of these kinds of trauma that's not natural to the human experience. Seeing people get blown up, dealing with just, I think even just the way, I mean, some people may argue this can be controversial, but I brought this up in classes that the way military soldiers are trained, that shit can be traumatic in and of itself. The whole boot camp, that's traumatic. Like some people say, oh, that's typical. You know, that's how, just because something is typical doesn't mean that it's fine. Doesn't mean that, okay, it's typical, so it's normal, so it's fine. No, it's not. Hell, it's typical for African American parents to beat their kids. That don't mean it's fine. So I made a whole nother video on that. You guys have to watch that, how I talk about childhood beatings in one of my other videos. But awareness is important. Critical thinking is one of my favorite ones, right? And I know some of you guys may be thinking, critical thinking, that sounds like psychoanalysis. While I am a huge fan of psychoanalysis, I have to say that psychoanalysis has its flaws. There are flaws in every, school of thought or theory. But I think with psychoanalysis, sometimes even with psychoanalysis and the psychodynamic approach, how they, want to go back to the first 5 years of a person's life and look at childhood, and they look at certain patterns and how patterns are developed, and looking at defense mechanisms. I kind of talked to you guys before about defense mechanisms in a totally different video. But how these defense mechanisms serve to kind of protect us and help reduce anxiety that we may be experiencing. So whether it's projection, people do that a lot. They kind of project their own internal state or feelings onto another person. They deny certain things, experiences, or feelings. They rationalize things. Those are all defense mechanisms. And those are great theories to help us conceptualize human behavior. But I feel like there are some parts of psychoanalytic theory that they just have holes in it, and it's kind of incomplete. And I feel like even practitioners of psychoanalytic theory, I assume, I guess, that they feel like, okay, they have a good grasp on a theory. And when it comes to application of it, they quick to assume, they make these interpretations. That's another intervention, essentially. So there's a theory and there's intervention, which is simply application of the theory. Theory and practice is intervention. And so when they're putting it into practice and they're making these interpretations of a client, it bothers me sometimes. I get bothered by a lot of things, but it's just, I don't like the way sometimes psychoanalysts are quick. Like, you will think that, okay, they're an expert and they just got it down pat and just perfect, right? No one is perfect. And if this field of psychology is to be seen as serious and to be seen through a scientific lens, because there's this whole debate as to whether or not psychology is even science. They're like, that's not real science. You have people say that. We know, okay, medicine, that's science, right? We know biology is science, but there's kind of a question as to whether or not psychology is science. And I get the reason why sometimes people question it, because when let's say you were to Google or YouTube certain, therapy videos, and you look at these videos, right, and see what the therapist is doing, or even go to therapy yourself, right, and let's say you go to a therapist that's rooted in psychoanalytic theory. So their approach is psychoanalysis or psychodynamic theory. And you'll know this because they will have on their website, and they'll tell you their frame of reference. And you're sitting across from them, and then they call themselves trying to conceptualize you or see what's going on. They make these interpretations, and oh my, it happened to me. It actually happened to me in class, y'all, in my psychodynamic class, right? Now, my professor, I brought this to his attention actually face to face. So it's not like I'm talking behind his back. Because anything I got to say to a person, I definitely will bring to their attention. But I have to say this, and I've said it before in another one of my videos, that bothered me. It's like, it's nothing worse than being misunderstood, I feel like. Like, you want people to see you, right? Like, especially if you reveal who you are to a person. You don't want a person to assume. And granted, assumptions is human mistake. People make mistakes. People are human. I get it. I don't get mad at people for making mistakes. But what I do get mad at is when a person doesn't own their mistake, or they dismiss it, or they just keep making it over and over again. Like, that can be pretty annoying. And especially if it's a mistake that's related to them making an assumption of who you are, or a misinterpretation. Just like, that needs to be corrected. I don't have a problem with a therapist, especially when they're skilled at it, making an interpretation that's accurate, especially if it's going to mean that it's going to help improve my life. But if you're making an interpretation of my behavior and you're way off, and what you're saying I know is not right, because I feel like ultimately, and this is just the way I think, this is my theory that I believe it and I'm sticking to it. This is my theory, and I've said this to my professors and a lot of people in my profession, is that I believe a client knows more about themselves than anybody else. Because that's what we're in the business to do, to empower. Now, you got some therapists, unfortunately, are in this business to disempower clients. I don't know where they get that shit from. Maybe they just sadist, sadistic. They want to use their license, their ability or whatever to take power away from the client to make themselves feel like, oh, I'm doctor this, I'm expert. And just like, no. When I'm in therapy in a room with the client, I mean, yes, I'm Danielle very much, but I can see myself kind of shrinking. And I don't know if I'm saying it right or using the right word, but I give power to the client, and it's in a very special way that I do it, because I feel like most clients come in disempowered. So it's not about me, puffing up my ego or showing off my intelligence no, that ain't what therapy is about, you know? It's about empowering the client. So to that, I believe it's the client who knows the story. They know more than anybody else. And it's my job. Where do I come in? It's my job as a therapist to help them along the way, to help them bring it out. Because some clients may need help with gaining insight. We all do. You just clients or whatever. It's everybody. Human beings, that's why we are interrelational people, interpersonal people. We're social beings. We benefit by being around other people because it's people who bring out the best of us and even the worst in us sometimes. And I feel like I like the client to tell their story, and it's important how they tell their story. Let them tell it how they tell it. You have therapists that want to jump in and want to guide them on how to tell it. I'm like, no, let them tell their story how they tell their story. And they know their story better than anybody else. And give them that power to do that. And with that, when it comes to psychoanalysis and people who are doing psychoanalysis call themselves trying to make an interpretation of what a client has said. So they're quick to assume, okay, oh, well, you said this. I heard you say this. So maybe perhaps it's because this. Now, I think a good psychoanalyst is strategic in how they do things, right? So you can have a person make an interpretation and be like, oh, yeah, that's the reason why. I see. That is the reason why. That's the reason why you didn't give me a direct answer, because you're avoiding. And you're avoiding because that's a pattern that you do in your life all the time. And you do that pattern in your life all the time because you have some childhood issues. I feel like that's bad. That's bad psychoanalysis. Because what do you hear is a therapist they jump into conclusions. And that's the reason why I say, although my fourth characteristic in my Leach theory is critical thinking, it may sound like psychoanalysis, is different because when critical thinking, you take the time to think. You don't jump to conclusions. And oftentimes in psychoanalysis, oh my, I see it. They jump to conclusions. They just swear up and down. They know that they know you better than you know yourself. And the way they deliver that interpretation, it may sound like they're very confident. They deliver it so confidently, like they will convince you that they know more about you than you know about yourself. And not only that, but that they're right. And it's just like, and they sometimes I say that they always wrong. I'm not saying that they just completely wrong, but I feel like you got to be careful, because with not only in the psychoanalytic theory is it said that clients have defense mechanisms, right? So they, may project their feelings, something that they're experiencing themselves, but they will project them to another person and be like, oh, she did this or she's that way. When really, that's how they are. That's how they are. Clients do it, but therapists do it too. So a therapist can make a faulty mistake of projecting their interpretations, their feelings, or some shit that they got going on in their own life onto the client. That's bad, because it may have nothing to do with the client. When you make an interpretation, your interpretation is based on evidence that the client has presented to you. That's the whole beauty of the scientist model. We're supposed to be operating from science. And science, you don't jump to conclusions. It has to be based on evidence. You got to be damn well pretty sure that what you're saying is right. You don't want to just be like, oh, yeah. So you avoided the question and it took you 20 minutes. Because I'm giving you an example of the kind of interpretations that you may see, right? In therapy from bad psychoanalysts. They'll be like, oh, it took you 20 minutes to answer this question. So you are avoiding the question. I notice there's some resistance. And that resistance is a pattern that is prevalent in your life. And that pattern came from childhood. And I'm wondering, and then no, I don't even really say that they're wondering, because that's actually a good psychoanalyst. That was part of me kind of coming out. I'm wondering. That's the difference. So a good psychoanalyst will be curious. That goes back to the L, my very first characteristic, listening and learning. You learn and you listen with a sense of curiosity. So a good psychoanalyst will say, I'm wondering if that is what it is. Instead of saying, oh yeah, you did that, so that's what it is. It's a difference. That's what an assumption is. And yes, we know just by the name itself, assumption is just like, okay, it's not fact, it's an assumption. But even how assumptions are made, it can cause a rupture in the relationship. And ruptures aren't necessarily good. I mean, it can be good if the therapist knows how to repair it and work from it and build on that rupture. But if you just keep having all these ruptures, eventually the client is going to shut down and you lost the client, because the client will be like, wait a minute, this therapist is way off. There's going to be a misattunement. And then the therapist is like, oh, well, this client is so defensive. You know, they're so resistant. And they're going to try to make this assumption that it's a pattern that exists in your life, when no, motherfucker, I'm resistant because that's you. It's situational. It's not a pattern. So that's what I mean by the difference between art and science, because science, you're not so quick to assume, and you're going to actually see the big picture, and you're going to also consider different variables. So not just say, oh, well, it's a pattern. Another variable would simply be that it's situational. So it can be contextual, specific to this particular context, where you, the therapist, is making this proposition that is not true, that's making the client become defensive, which they have every right to be defensive, because you are trying to define them through a lens that is not true. And even, okay, yes, there's a case to say, okay, well, if a therapist, let's say a psychoanalyst, is right, and they make this interpretation that is true, the client still can become defensive because that's not how they see themselves. So yes, there's a case for that, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about therapists who just be throwing stuff out there. And a lot of times they are talking about themselves. They are projecting parts of who they are, issues that they are dealing with, onto the client. Totally misattuned. So you got to think critically. And in thinking critically, I don't know if you guys remember, in grade school, how we would have like these critical thinking assignments, and it would be in math, it would be in all different kinds of subjects, math, science, English, and it would kind of be at the end. And I think, from I remember, we would get like more points to do it if you did it right. And it actually took time. It actually took longer than all the other questions on the assignment to complete the critical thinking question. It takes time. Speaking of time, okay, 20 more minutes. So yeah, it took time to complete this critical thinking exercise. That's my point. Critical thinking takes time, you guys. It takes time. Now, granted, over time, yes, one can make the argument that a therapist, they hone their skills, they become better, and with practice comes perfection, and you end up not having to require as much time to do a certain thing or make an interpretation or whatever as you would, let's say, if you're a newbie therapist, so to speak. But then one can also make the argument that no, everybody is different. And just because you have a certain framework that you've been working from over a certain number of years don't mean that, okay, you can just apply that framework to every single client and it's going to work out just the same and everything is going to be the same. No, everybody is different, and that's how I see it. Yes, when you're seeing clients, right, let's say you're treating African American clients with depression. So yes, there are certain common characteristics, that are pretty much kind of similar across different clients within that population, but it's important to see every single client for who they are, because one African American who's depressed is going to look different from another African American who is depressed. Could be depressed for different reasons. One could be depressed from, in their viewpoint, systemic racism. One could be depressed from drugs, or isolation, not having friends or being isolated from their family. I mean, different things. So many variables are at play, is what I'm trying to say. With so many variables, requires a person to think critically about these things. I feel like that's the kind of psychologist I see myself becoming. Not one who takes shortcuts, but one who applies science to this thing. And art too, because y'all know I'm an artist. I think creatively myself and can meld the two together to be able to really be in the best service for my clients. So when I'm making a conceptualization, not to say that even when I meld science and art and I think critically that, oh, I'm completely right. No, but at least there would come a certain degree of confidence that I'm right. And with that confidence, hey, there's still some uncertainty. There's still that degree of error, even with that confidence that I'm going to be mindful of. So that's that. I got to keep going because I have to be mindful of time. So the last one, I already talked about listening, empathy, awareness, critical thinking. The last one, H, is happiness. Those are the 5 characteristics I believe that make an effective psychologist. And happiness, I think all of them are important. Happiness is kind of one of my favorites too, because I believe like if you are going to be a therapist, psychologist, working to increase someone else's functioning in life, which will impact their degree of satisfaction, ultimately their happiness, then shouldn't you be happy yourself? Like, to me, that just makes sense. But I find it quite jarring that I come across psychologists. Like I said, I'm surrounded by psychologists, and sometimes it can be annoying. Y'all don't understand. I mean, I don't know. Maybe y'all may think that it's cool. Right? It's cool. You're surrounded by psychologists. It can be annoying because you're surrounded by people who just think they know, think they God, number one. They think they're God. And that can be annoying as hell. They think they know everything. They want to analyze you. That can be so annoying to just be under someone's scrutiny or analytical lens all the time. Just like, get off me, dude. Get off my bag. Like everything, every behavior, every move you make. I drink some water, which I'm thirsty now. I could drink some water, be like, oh, you're nervous. It's just like, and it's not just that they're analyzing you. It's that the lens is negative. Like they're analyzing you to assign a pathology on you, to assign a diagnosis. It's like unfortunately, that's how we're trained in the field of psychology. And that's the reason why I'm different, because there are different fields within psychology. So you have positive psychology who views things through a positive lens. I mean, it's kind of self-explanatory, but viewing things through a positive lens, it takes work, because when you're trained to look for symptoms and to diagnose, because that's the nature of the business. That's how psychologists get paid, through insurance. That's how, if you don't have a diagnosis, you ain't getting paid. That's what it is. And if the clients know this, they should. Maybe they don't, but it's kind of common knowledge, And that's just the nature of the business. It's unfortunate. That's why I say I'm going to be different, because in private practice, you can do things slightly different. You don't have to take insurance. You can. Some people in private practice do take insurance. It's a lot of work to be on insurance panels. That's a whole nother discussion. But with being in private practice and not taking insurance, it's not about coming up with a diagnosis. That's, I think, the biggest thing for me. Because I'm like, okay, yes, the DSM. which I do have a copy of. Show you guys real quick. I done showed you guys this before, but it's a book that we use to diagnose clients. This little manual here, purple manual by the American Psychiatric Association. Interesting. Now psychologists are part of the American Psychological Association, right? But guess whose book? Psychiatric Association. And they're on the DSM version 5. There have been so many versions over the years. Psychiatric, that says something. So this book was developed by psychiatrists, medical doctors, because psychiatrists are medical doctors who have training in both medicine and psychology. Psychiatry specifically with regard to the psychotropic medications that they come up with. And yeah, so that's a whole nother discussion. It's more into politics and stuff like that. So I know some people in the profession probably don't like me because I'm just too real for them. But yeah, it's driven by money, everybody know that. So with the labeling comes diagnosis, diagnosis comes money, That's what drives it. That's why they got so many different names for everything. And it's helpful. I mean, it's advantages and disadvantages to labeling. We talk about that like in our psychopathology class that we take in year 1. But, the advantages would be, okay, you have a name for it. Sometimes sometimes clients want to know, they just want to go and like, what's wrong with me? Just tell me what's wrong with me, They just want to know, having that name, being able to put a name on it's like, okay, now you can treat it. So that's a benefit. But anyway, let me get back on topic. So happy is important because like I said, I'm around so many different psychologists, and you would think that, okay, you're in the game, to increase people's functioning, and ultimately that's going to increase their life satisfaction and make them happy. And why these people ain't happy? The people that work in the field, okay, 15 minutes. The people that work in the field, not to say all of them are not happy, but I mean, you come across some psychologists who don't give off the aura that they're happy. And you're like, out of all people, you're trying to make other people happy. Why your ass ain't happy? Like, what's going on with you, Not that you gotta be walking around like cheesing all the time, But I just think it says something. It says something, about why people are not happy. And I feel like as psychologists, like one of our roles is to model positive things for our clients. I mean, that's just part of the human relationship. That's something that's going to happen naturally, the whole modeling thing. That's like parents, like how as a parent, you're going to teach your child to do something, right? They're going to look up to you. That happens naturally. You don't have to teach modeling. Modeling is a natural process that just happens subconsciously. And so you trying to teach your child, let's say, how to be organized, right? You telling them, you need to clean up your room, you do this. But if your car not clean, your house not clean, they're modeling after you. So that kind of goes into the systems approach to therapy, because you'll have parents who want to send their kid to therapy and be like, fix my child. And it's like, no, you need to come in here too. Let's have family therapy. But hey, that's a whole other subject. But yeah, so when me seeing, like, being around psychologists, and I'm seeing psychologists who they got this stern look, some look angry. I'm like, why are you looking angry? Now, unless it's specific to your role, it's different because, like I say, this profession is very diverse. You have all kinds of forensic psychologists who work in, law and criminal justice. You have school psychologists, clinical psychologists, counseling psychologists. Oh my gosh. Industrial organizational psychologists who work with companies and organizations to help bring about change. You have child psychologists. I know there's so many kinds. Geropsychologists working with older people. So many kinds of psychologists. So I know, yes, you have to have a certain phase depending on the profession that you're in. But I'm like just speaking to clinical psychology and, like I said, psychotherapy at the beginning of this video. It's like, come on. Psychotherapy. Be happy. Why are these people walking around mean mugging? Like, unless you're working, I don't know, in criminal justice, and I guess maybe you might need that, right? But I don't know. To me, it's kind of contradictory. contradictory. And with happiness comes humor. So I was thinking, should I say the H means humor or happy? And I think I want to stick with happy. But with that, I mean, humor can be a part of that too. Using humor, a good therapist knows how to use humor to help move the session along too, as a therapeutic tool. And there's a lot of research on that, using humor in the context of therapy. But be happy. Ironically, that's the name of my organization that I founded around my research interest on Black identity development and culturation in African American parents and implicit racial bias in children. That's actually the focus of my dissertation in my research in my PhD program that I'm currently in the process of working on now. But be happy. And it's spelled BIHAPI. The B stands for Black Identity and Health and African People International. Be happy. And it took me a while to think of that name. So I'm like, dang. First I was thinking like be happy. I'm like, nah. And then out of nowhere, I'm like, okay, be happy. Like, no, that be app, no. And then the H came in. I'm like, health. Health is important to identity. Because I was so much focused on, okay, Black identity. That's like one of the main constructs in my research, Black identity, which sometimes gets kind of pushed on a back burner in discussion of. I'm surprised I was able to go this long without getting a notification. But yeah, kind of Black identity or identity itself kind of gets pushed on the back burner, no matter if it's cultural identity or ethnic identity or sexual identity, religious identity, so many different types of identity. And I think that identity is like who we are at our core. That's so important. But there's not really much discussion on identity when it comes to mental health. We talk about these illnesses so much, depression, anxiety, all these symptoms. And like, yes, that's important. But what about a person's identity, how they see themselves? What about the cultural identity assessment? We assess for so many different things, but what about assessing for one's identity? Where do they fall? And working on that, we have interventions for all kinds of stuff in the field of mental health. What about interventions for identity? People who are somehow lost in their identity, which you see that a lot. And then it's interesting because I had a colleague ask me, so how do you approach clients who are, let's say, African American clients who are lost somewhere in their identity, right? How do you approach that? And I'm like, interesting question. And how I approach it would depend on their readiness, because it's not about me trying to impose my belief system onto them. Let's say I come across an African American with dark skin, right? It's clear that they are Black. But identity means different things for different people. And how one chooses to identify is their choice. That's within their control. That's not something that a therapist can say, oh, well, you're Black, so you need to be Black. That's the identity that you should choose. I mean, now outside of the profession, obviously, let's say if you're a politician or, whatever you are, then you can probably take that stance, But within the profession, of course, that's not necessarily the approach, and we are held to certain legal and ethical guidelines, codes, specifically ethical. And it's not really ethical to do that, to say, oh, you got to do, unless it's life or death, which, I mean, one can argue one's identity is kind of life or death, so to speak. But in terms of immediate, like, life or death, I don't know. It's not really considered that, it's not like a life or death in terms of suicide type of thing, right? Suicide risk. But one can make the argument like, yeah, how you identify, if you're Black, then it could be, do you identify as Black? And it could speak to, okay, if a person is African American and don't choose to identify as Black, then that could be their form of a survival mechanism, so to speak. So, now you got me thinking. But back to her question is like, it's not really, I think, it's not up to me to say, oh, well, just because our client puts down on the intake form that they're African American, that I should say, okay, well, I need to work on that. No, that's, a client comes in, it's up to them to choose what they want to work on. I can make a suggestion to say, hey, well, I'm curious, would you like to do this? But ultimately it's not my choice. And I find the question quite interesting from my colleague, but nonetheless, happy listening, having empathy, having an awareness, critical thinking, and happiness. Leach, Leach. Those are the 5 characteristics that I believe make an effective psychologist, therapist. And I think essentially those 5 characteristics can be applied to many different things, not just to be an effective psychologist or a therapist, but to be an effective supervisor, to be an effective leader, boss, whatever your role is. I think those things can go a long way when it comes to developing interpersonal relationships. But hey, I think that's pretty much it for now. And I will catch you guys in the next one because I have class. All right. Thank you guys for watching. Please share this video. I know someone else can benefit from it. And I'll catch you guys later. And Facebook better not put no boogers in my nose. All right. Bye. Love you guys. Bye.